Jesus compared the days of his coming to the days of Noah. What did he mean? Some think Nephilim giants will be on the earth. Some think those days will be of great evil and violence. Others think it's a reference to the mark of the beast, and today we're going to find out. Now, this channel uses Scripture to interpret Scripture to solve mysteries just like this. If you're new here and that's important to you, consider subscribing and joining this community. Now, in order to allow Scripture to interpret Scripture, we need to look at the passage in context, at the verses that surround it. Most don't realize this, but this passage is part of what is known as the fig tree parable. So it's in that context that Jesus' words can be understood. So although everyone wants to jump into the supernatural part of the video, in order to understand it, we have to quickly look at the context first. Jesus' disciples had come to Jesus and asked him two questions. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Now, Jesus had just mentioned that the temple was about to be destroyed and not a single stone left on another, so the disciples' first question was, when was this going to happen? Their second question involved what would be the sign of Jesus' coming and the end of the age. We discussed the 4 signs Jesus gave them of his glorious return in this previous video. We have included a link for this video down in the description. In fact, Jesus used the 27 verses of prophecy between the disciples' question and the fig tree parable to give those signs. The beginning of the birth pangs, the abomination of desolation, the preaching of the gospel to the whole world, the cosmic signs of the darkening of the sun, moon, and stars, and his coming like lightning. After giving the signs, Jesus turned to the disciples' question about timing, and he did so in the form of a parable. The fig tree parable. Here's what he said. "From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as the branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates." Jesus reminds the disciples that they can tell that summer is near when they see the leaves begin to bud on a fig tree, and that in exactly the same way, his followers can tell the season of his return when they see all these things, all the signs. Not just some. Jesus continued, "Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." He says that a single generation will see all these things take place. This generation does not refer to the generation of apostles, but the generation that sees the signs. And this generation can also mean the generation of the righteous. So it implies that not all the righteous will be killed in the Great Tribulation. Some will not pass away. Jesus also says heaven and earth will be changed, and the current way the world was will not be the same by Jesus' words. The signs of his coming will endure right up until the end. We are to know these signs to watch for by reading his word. Then we can recognize the season, just as the fig tree leaves identify the coming of summer. Jesus continued his explanation of this parable about the timing of his return in a section that most don't realize is still in the context of the parable. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And here's where the phrase, the days of Noah, comes into play. Jesus, in this parable, tells us what we can know and what we can't know. He had just said we could know the seasons by the way the fig tree leaves bud. and we could know the season of his return when we see all the signs that he's given. But no one but the Father could know the exact day and hour of his return in advance. That day and hour would be like the days of Noah before the flood. So the days of Noah is an analogy to knowing the days of the coming of Jesus. And it's about the timing of that event. Let me say that again. The days of Noah are about knowing the season of Jesus' return and taking the appropriate action. So what was it like in the days of Noah? What did the people of those days know about the timing of the flood? Well, Noah knew the flood was coming well in advance. God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. And 6 days prior to the flood, God gave Noah a warning about the day the flood would take place. For in 7 days I will send rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground. To which you will probably say, Nelson, the passage says 7 days, not 6 days. That is absolutely correct, except that Hebrews calculated time inclusively. Unlike what we do today, they counted the day they were on as the first day. So when God said 7 days, he meant today and 6 more days. This is important in terms of timing. Very, very important. Now, a common misconception in the church is that this 7 days in Genesis 7:4 refers to the 7-year-long 70th week of Daniel. I mean, it makes sense, except that now you know that they're actually 6 days, not 7. In our current modern way of determining time, you can see that that old idea is impossible. Now, I think those 6 days are related to the 70th week of Daniel, but not the exact full 70th week of Daniel. And at the end of this video, we'll explain how. Now, no matter what these days mean prophetically, Noah knew in advance the season of the flood. And Christians who are symbolized by Noah and his family in the flood account will know in advance that Jesus will soon return. They will know the season because they will have seen the signs. And here's a shocker. The unrighteous will also know that Jesus is coming. I think that surprises most people. In the days of Noah, Noah told them a flood was coming. They just didn't listen to him. And God, did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. Noah, the preacher of righteousness, preached, but the ungodly didn't listen. I think this is another important lesson that Jesus is trying to get across in calling these the days of Noah. Noah knew it was a season of the flood and preached it. Christians in the end times will know it's the season of Jesus' return and will preach it. But unfortunately, the unrighteous just won't listen. We know that by the next statement Jesus makes. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. Now, how does eating and drinking figure into not realizing it's the season of the wrath of God? How will the unrighteous eat and drink during the Great Tribulation? Ask yourself that. They will eat and drink under the mark of the beast. Only with the mark of the beast will they be able to buy and sell and be able to eat and drink. Jesus mentions this eating and drinking again in the very next parable, the parable of the wise and foolish slaves that he told later in the same chapter. When talking about the wise slave in this parable, Jesus said he provides God's household with food at the appointed time. This provision of food will take place so God's household doesn't feel forced to take the mark of the beast. They will eat the food stored by the wise slave. But here is what's said about the foolish slave. But if that wicked slave says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour he does not know, and will cut him to pieces. There is that phrase again, eats and drinks. In this follow-up parable, which is Scripture interpreting Scripture, Jesus is explaining what he just went over in the teaching about the days of Noah. He says that there will be two servants trying to serve him. A wise slave who stores food for the end times and provides it for God's household so they don't have to take the mark of the beast. And there will be a foolish servant who says his master's coming is delayed. How can someone live during the Great Tribulation, right before Jesus' return, because that's what this slave does, and that's what those in the days of Noah do, and still say Jesus' coming is delayed? Only if they miss the signs of the season of Jesus' return. This slave in this parable would have had to have seen the beginning of the birth pangs and said, those aren't signs. He would have had to seen the sign of the abomination of desolation and the Antichrist sit in the temple of God and declare himself God. And still, he would have had to say, this isn't the Antichrist. That's not the abomination. And when the mark of the beast was offered to him, he would have to say, this isn't the mark of the beast. And he would have had to have taken the mark, because he ends up eating and drinking with drunkards. He doesn't just eat and drink. Drunkard is a symbolic word in the Scriptures for a sinner. And the only way a sinner will eat and drink at that time is by taking the mark of the beast, so he can buy and sell. So it makes sense that this entire passage is discussing those who will see the sign of the season of Jesus' return. Some will act appropriately, and those who don't know the signs will act as if life were just to go on normally. And these persons end up taking the mark of the beast. That is what eating and drinking is about in the Noah account. But what about marrying and giving in marriage, you might ask? This same phrase is found in Luke 17 in regard to the days of Lot. It is another analogy that Jesus told about his return, that it would be like the days leading up to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Jesus said likewise. Just as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking, there's that phrase again, buying and selling, planting and building, but on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained down from heaven and destroyed them all. So will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. Here Jesus adds two additional items, buying and selling, which we know is also a mark of the beast related item, and planting and building, which also likely is. Now, in addition to these mark of the beast references, these items also imply life going on as normal, that the unrighteous think things are not abnormal at all. Considering this is during the Great Tribulation, right before Jesus' return, this also shows they have taken the mark, because those without the mark will be hunted and killed by the Antichrist. And since the unrepentant are not hiding, thinking things are just normal, they must have taken the mark. Now, returning to marrying and giving in marriage, we can assume that those in Sodom, which is the city where the days of Lot took place, possibly had unlawful and unnatural marriages. This may have been part of the meaning of that phrase. And we know in the days of Noah that people were engaging in unlawful and unnatural marriages as well. Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. And here is where the idea of a Nephilim comes into play. So let's discuss it. Now, what we just read is a very controversial passage, maybe one of the most controversial in the whole Bible. Some say the sons of God are angels. Others say they're the descendants of righteous Seth, who ended up marrying the women descendants of Cain. This latter idea is very, very popular because the idea of angelic or divine beings marrying human women is pretty upsetting and disgusting to most. However, if we use Scripture to interpret Scripture, we see they are likely angels. 3 times in the book of Job, Job 1:6 to 1 and 38:7, this phrase, sons of God, refer to divine beings who existed prior to the creation of the world. So like it or not, the supernatural solution appears to be the correct one. Angels married human women and later had offspring. So, although I favor a primary reading of this passage about the days of Noah that just implies that life is going on normally for the unrighteous under the mark of the beast, it could possibly have a supernatural component to it as well. And we know that Satan and his angels are cast down to the earth at the midpoint of the 70th week of Daniel. So what happens when they're cast down? Might some of them marry humans? I don't know. I imagine it might be possible during the time of the Great Tribulation. But what about Nephilim? Are they the offspring of this type of union? Well, some say yes, some say no. Here is a passage from Genesis 6. The Nephilim or giants were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man and bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Now some say the Nephilim were on the earth at the same time as these unnatural unions, but were not the result of them. But you know, that phrase really seems to link the fact that the giants were there because of the unions, that they were the children of those unions. So, is it possible that Nephilim will be born during the Great Tribulation to such unnatural unions? Will Nephilim babies be around then? Well, maybe. But even if that is true, I think that is a very unimportant aspect of what Jesus is driving at in this passage. And we should absolutely not focus our attention on the supernatural when reading about the days of Noah. It's primarily about knowing the signs of Jesus' soon return and living lives that reflect that fact, and teaching all our churchgoers what those signs are so they're prepared, so they're not the ones taking the mark of the beast. Now, we promised we'd talk about the days of Noah in Genesis 7:4, the 6 days. If these days in Genesis 7:4 are actually meant to symbolize years prophetically in regard to Jesus' return, like a massive amount of the prophetic community believes, then these 6 days would mean that the rescue of believers, which is symbolized by Noah's rescue, would happen 6 years into the 70th week of Daniel. That would give us an approximate timing for the rapture. And if that is accurate, it is the pre-wrath rapture of the church as we present on this channel. The rapture taking place after 6 years, and the wrath of God, which follows, taking 1 year and 10 days. This is a perfect 7-year 70th week of Daniel, because the final year, the year before the Jubilee, is 10 days longer than a regular year. a year and 10 days. These lengths of time would fulfill the sabbatical cycle, which is part of a jubilee cycle, of 6 years of toil and a year of rest that repeat on and on throughout the Jewish years. Since Daniel's 70th week is one of these sabbatical cycles, it is perfect timing to have 6 years of work and then a year of rest. In this previous video, we discussed the prophetic implications of the timing of Noah's flood and its relationship to the rapture. We realize this is a little bit complex, so you might want to watch this video. As with the other videos we mentioned, the link is down in the description. So when Jesus used the phrase, the days of Noah, was he giving us a clue to the timing of the rapture? Well, maybe he was. And when he was talking about the days of Noah, was he giving us a clue as to something supernatural? Well, like I said, I don't like to concentrate on the supernatural because I don't think that's the main point of the phrase, but you know, he might have been. However, you know, the supernatural angelic realm isn't something we should ignore completely either, because it's impacting our world right now, today. In fact, divine beings are controlling the nations you and I live in. If you want to learn more about how that could be possible, well, click right here to keep watching and learn why this world is such a messed up place. It has a lot to do with the demonic powers who are in charge. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.